everyone, welcome to another Sonic Lab. Today we're looking at the Korg SQ64, which is a new hardware sequencer from Korg, which handles both control voltage and MIDI, and in many ways it's sort of a similar feature set to something like the BeatStep Pro or the KeyStep Pro, although obviously this is a slightly different format because we've got a lot more buttons. But essentially the similarities are that we've got 3 melodic tracks which can work on MIDI but also can output control voltage. We've got mod, pitch, gate for each one, 3 channels of that, and then 8 trigger outputs for a drum track. So we've got 4 tracks altogether, A, B, C and D. One thing I will say is it is built. This thing weighs and feels really sturdy and kind of, it feels like way more sturdy than you would expect for something of this kind of size. A few more interesting features and facts. I'm running this on the power supply. It does take a regular power supply. I think it's a 9-volt power supply, but it doesn't come with a power supply. MIDI connections are on the Korg mini jacks. I've got all 3 connected here, but you need to have the proper Korg connectors. It doesn't come with those either, so no power supply, none of that. But it also has USB power supply, but if you use the USB power supply you don't get quite as much brightness to the LCDs and the LEDs because it's not quite as much juice. And also it's on a micro, I think it is. Anyway, the really tiny one, which sort of thing that you might have originally had on your mobile phone, which, to be honest, I'm over that. I don't really want those anymore. I mean, I know this case is a bit thin in terms of height, so you might not be able to get one of the larger format, but it seems like most people seem to move over to those because they're just a bit more sturdy. You've got a bit more of a positive connection. Would have liked to have seen that, but hey-ho. Never mind. A bit more about how this works. Obviously, the similarity to the other sequencer products sort of stops there because we don't have a keyboard, we don't have 16 pads, we've got actually 64. You select the track that you're working on here, so for instance we've got some drilling next door, sorry about that. We've got the 3 melodic tracks, which, as I say, they could be monophonic or they can be polyphonic, and you have up to 8 notes for a chord on each one of these 3. Then the track D is the drum track, and that has 16 subtracks. So you can have MIDI notes on 8 and CV on 8, or you can assign them how you want. What you do is you select the track that you want to work on. For instance, that's the kick, that's the snare, that's the hi-hat. In fact, why don't I just play what I've got? Because I've got a pattern going on here. What I'm doing is I'm driving a number of things. So I'll start with MIDI is coming out and going into the Pulsar 23. Then I've got track 1, the Pittsburgh modular. Then I've got the Sculpt on track B. And then over here, we can't quite see, is the D-Mine 12. And as you can hear, it's able to run a whole bunch of that, and there's quite a lot of variation. Anyway, I'll stop that because otherwise I'll have to shout over it. Let's come back to the thing. I've got a little extra overlay here so you can see a bit more what's going on. Each of these tracks basically has a gate track, a pitch track and a mod track, so you need to basically dial in what you want. Now you can do it in step sequence mode or you can record in real-time mode. You can record via the external MIDI, which I've got plugged in here, and again, if I switch to this shot, you see I've just got a KeyStep which is plugged in going into the input. So once I set the channel on my input, it goes through to the instrument. I would like to have seen a bit smarter stuff going on with the MIDI, because if I've got switched the active track, it would be nice if whatever I feed into it just gets sent through to the requisite device. Otherwise, because at the moment I've got to keep changing MIDI channels on here to get through to where I want. In fact, if I hit pitch and then the track, I've got a keyboard mode, which means I could play in real time. Not ideal, or you know, and I can change the key of these, and I've got this sort of, you know, whether I want equal temperament, poly, or equal scale. Lots of different scales in here if you want to use it that way. I mean, me personally, I prefer to play something externally, so I've just got a bit more of a vibe, because this will also record kind of off-grid quantized, so you can get a bit more groove and feel. Each one also has a gate channel, and we can, if you press and hold, if I bring that up, we can say whether or not we want, I mean, well, let's go here. I can say what I want the length of that gate to be. It defaults to 75. We've got an offset, probability. Probability is really interesting because we can actually set the probability to percentages, or we can come this way and say that we'll have it sort of once every 2 bars, second of 2 bars, once every 3 bars, once every 4, and then we've got step divisions which give us these sort of ratchets. If I come back to my 100% probability here, I've got a few things going on this track, so I think I've got alternating on certain. Actually, I'll just turn all of this down and you can hear what this track is doing. I've got probability set on different notes on here, so out of this 64 step I've got these sort of variants that come along. And again, if I then take the bass line out and go to my drum track, I can mute this, shift and mute will mute a track. So my bass drum track, I've got all these little extra fills, which I've got different probabilities. Again, if I go to my hi-hats, I'm using that a lot more. So I've got these little ratchets which have different probabilities. So I've got much longer than just the 32 parts here. But it's actually really cool because it does allow you to create, in a sort of step vibe, much more variants and variations. And that's actually quite enjoyable. I quite like the way that that works. If we come back to the main track here, if I go to pitch, we could say, if I want to say a chord here, I press on this guy and we could dial in up to 8 notes, which is actually really handy. That's quite, you know, I'm set different inversions for those chords as well. I really like those tweakability. There's a very different way of viewing the data than you have on something like the BeatStep Pro or the KeyStep Pro. So let's take a look at some of these other track parameters, because there's kind of interesting things here. So I've got my bass line going, I've got 64 steps, I press that, I can actually also rotate by a number of steps, so kind of effectively offsetting and creating these kind of perhaps patterns I would not have thought about creating. And then I've also got a fill, which doesn't really work so much here, but if I go to my drum track and I start dialing in a fill amount, it starts filling in the other patterns and creating again this sort of, these kind of random additional notes, which is actually another really interesting feature. I'm not quite sure how musically relevant that is, but it will allow you to do it. So again, another thing to look at is in terms of the gate length, we can actually create slides. So I've got a little bass pattern here that's, if I press that, turn the drums down a bit. So I can create slides, so you could do that kind of 303 type stuff if you want. And that's all kind of pretty cool. I'm not a big fan of programming things in like that, but it does give you those options. It gives you the kind of shape of the slide, so you've got a little bit of extra control over it. There's more stuff here. That if I just take the steps down to 4, we can see that we've got all these different ratchets, ramps, which gives us this kind of quite glitchy programming potential. So we can create almost like Cabasa tracks out of hi-hats and all that sort of stuff. So that's quite handy, having that granularity over the step patterns. I've not seen that again in a sequencer. So we've got all these different ways of multi-triggering stuff, and we can create these sort of very granular, and also you can get the probability on those, so we can create some quite interesting and varied rhythm tracks just by sort of dialing in those probabilities. And it's not actually too painful a thing. And the other thing that we could do with this, which is actually pretty cool, is we can kind of select multiple steps at the same time and just have those affected. Which is again useful, so I could be creating all of these tracks if I wanted to, as many fingers as I've got, and then dialing in those changes in parameters. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the polyphonic aspects of the sequencer. I've got a track here. If I just bring my overlay up, we can see it. I'm playing my Deepmind. So what I'm going to do is I've set this to 16 steps long, but in holding shift I can adjust the parameters of these tracks. So the step lengths are going to be quarter notes on this. So if I play 3, you can see what's going on here. These are the step notes that I'm recording. So I'll just play in, go to record, 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually playing in non-8-step time, so it's recorded it unquantized here. So I just turn the drums and the bass down, you can just hear. If we look at the gates, you can see that there's offsets on different ones, so it's recorded as is, which is great, apart from the fact there doesn't seem to be an actual quantized function. So if I did actually play that at a time, I couldn't snap them back in. I'd have to go in and essentially dial all the offsets back, but I want to keep it like that. So if we now go to the pitch track and we have a look at the notes that I've played on these various steps, we can also see that there's an inversion parameter. So if I can set these plus or minus, so I can sort of create a different top line just by changing the inversions on each of the steps, which is actually pretty cool. God, sorry, I can set this to be mono, which would work for using the gate outputs, but I'm going to take it into ARP mode. So now I'll play the track. And you can hear there's actually kind of arpeggiating those at a sort of fairly quick rate, but I can press shift again here and I can adjust the arpeggiation rate to 1 times. So it's kind of working-ish in tempo, so I can still change the inversions. But what you're seeing there is the ability to kind of drastically transform this track by switching into poly mode and using the inversions from the original thing that I played in. And that's really kind of quite creative, actually. The only thing I will say is there's no way to kind of go back to where I was. You know, if I've adjusted all of those individual steps, there's no sort of reset without it clear. And that brings me on to something else about this. If I want to, say I didn't like that take, I wanted to clear it, there's a really great shortcut, which if I put the overlay, I can press shift and press one of these buttons at the end, which is clear, and I can clear that track, which is fantastic. So now I could do it again, but I've also got an undo, and this works across all the tracks. But if I do that, then my settings for this track have also reset, so I have to go back into quarter notes, and if I change the step length, all of that would be cleared as well. Now, I know this is the same on, say, the KeyStep Pro, but I'd like to have seen this to be able to be really, really quick. If I wanted to re-record that pattern, I could just do clear and do it again. I can't just clear the pattern but keep all the other parameters intact. And that I'd like to see an option for that, at least, because it make it much faster to re-record things. And by the same token, having that arpeggiator in there on each of these pitch tracks is okay, but it would be great to have a little bit more granularity in the arpeggiator rate. So if I just put a chord on this step and a chord on this step, have it hold and maybe change pattern, so we could use arpeggiator much more integrated into the whole sequence. As it stands, it's more like a kind of like a flam, you know, a variable speed flam rather than a true arpeggiator. So maybe a firmware thing where we get a bit more arpeggiation function would actually make this even more flexible. There's a couple of other little features here, and these are in the global setting. So if we disable a track, we're in sort of global for the overall unit. Now we're going to, we can see we've got plenty of MIDI and transport options. The one that I'm interested in is the keyboard. Now the keyboard, we've got these different modes. So in the keys mode, so for instance, I'm playing my track here, and I come back to my pitch mode, and I can enable the keyboard. And this means that the keyboard, the internal keyboard, will transpose the sequence, which is kind of useful. Doesn't work from the external MIDI input, unfortunately. But there's another mode which is really important, and this actually threw me to begin with. We'll come out of here. What we actually want is to be able to switch the keyboard mode into override sequencer behavior. And this is really important because if you don't do this, when you're playing the sequencer, the external MIDI input has no bearing. It doesn't go through and play. Whereas when you set it to override rather than transpose, what that enables is the MIDI, incoming MIDI will then go out. So you can record your drum track and then play along with the bass line before you record it. If you haven't got it set to this, it won't, and you'll be scratching your head for ages going, how do I do that? So remember, if you're not able to play from your MIDI input out to your active tracks while the sequencer is playing, it's this. Change the keyboard mode from transpose to override. Very important. There's another really interesting feature which kind of affects the performance possibilities for this, and that is loop mode. So we've got these tracks, we've got gate, pitch, the mod. Obviously the mod track enables us to output whatever the mod is and record mod points and have those go out here, which is all well and good, something that you'd be used for with other sequencers. But the loop mode is another quite interesting concept. So if I just pray, that's my track. I take my drum track and I'm going to go into select mode. I can basically have it repeat over certain steps that I choose and then change the playback. And it comes in and out of while it's in phase, which is really handy. So say for instance if I go to my bassline track, I've also got the ability to do a range, so I could just go, let's have these. Just these guys. Or maybe combine that with select. And create these kind of random playbacks with different time divisions and also randomness, so we can kind of build this entire other thing from what is a basic 16-step pattern or a 32-step pattern. Really quite interesting. And when we're using that in with the drums, we've got, again, we can kind of create these overlapping step loops and whatnot. It does take a bit of getting used to, but once you kind of get your head around it, you can do some really interesting things, and perhaps this will work better with kind of maybe longer evolving ambient things where you get things cascading over one another. And again, this is an aspect to the sequencer I hadn't really considered. I mean, usually I'm used to, you know, I play the notes in, I maybe change the step divisions, that's kind of it, you know, maybe a bit of velocity or tweaking, but these things take it into a whole new level of tweakability. Right, I just want to point out one little weird anomaly. I've got my drum track triggers here, which are on track D. So as we can see, we've got all the sub tracks here. So I've got my kick, my snare, my hi-hat, and the little sort of blip sound coming back here, which I can play via MIDI, and that's all good. But what I can't do is actually record from this external keyboard into track D. Works fine for the first 3 melodic tracks, but not D. I've been told that this is something that's probably going to be addressed in a firmware update quite soon, but for now, For whatever reason, you can't do that, and I think they'll probably fix that pretty sharpish. I just did want to point that out though. So let's take a look at some of the pattern modes. Okay, so let's start off with our basic pattern. I'm going to change the baseline, which is on the bar boundaries. I've got some other different patterns here. Got a bit of, bring my sculpt in a little bit. And I've got this sort of half-time pattern. Now that goes wrong because that should sound like this on the bar boundary. Let's go back to there. Go back here again. No, that's wrong. That should be doing this. So there is a little bit of wonkiness going on there. I can't quite put my finger on it. I mean, I've got differing step lengths and steps in here. So if I go to my gates and I press shift, you know, I've got quarter notes, the rest are 16s a quarter, so there's a mix and match a little bit there. I wonder if that's causing it. But ultimately, it's not quite working right, and that's a bit disappointing. But there is another method that we can use. So if I press shift and go into performance, I enter pattern chain mode. And I'm going to go into edit, and what that allows me to do is create chains of patterns. You can see I've got a few pre-made here. So it's easy. Basically, I just press slot 1, I want the pattern to be pattern 1. Slot 2, I want the pattern to be pattern 1. Slot 3, I want pattern to be pattern 1. So now when I press play, you can see I've got all of these patterns going at different arrangements, up to 16. And that's quite cool because that means I can create these arrangements, pattern chains, they're saved with the song. I don't know, I wasn't getting any of that wonkiness when I was pre-making them in here, but in the live switching, I was. And like I say, I'm not entirely sure why that happened. Right, there is one last thing to look at this. I mean, that's the thing about this. There is an awful lot of stuff going on. There is also a control mode, which turns the surface into something that sends out MIDI commands. If I just open that up, these are just notes, and then the knobs will just send certain MIDI values, and there are 4 banks of these. I couldn't figure out a way to change it. I mean, I was told in the manual it says that you can assign them by pressing these, but this didn't seem to make any difference to me. But I guess it's kind of useful. It does say that there is an editor that you can change those assignments, so you can set that up for those pads to be control mappings, and you can change it up how you want. I mean, I guess it's useful to have, but I'm not sure I would want to be flipping modes like that. A couple of other things while we're on the subject. Obviously, we've got swing control. We can swing globally, or we can swing on a per track basis, plus or minus swing, which is kind of handy. I think the thing that I found is stuff like if I'm in pattern mode and I'm setting things up, I would like the shift to still do things like mute the tracks, because if I'm arranging things, then that's the sort of time I'm likely to be doing that. So there are a few little mode issues that I'm kind of a little unsure about. And like I say, the pattern chaining or the pattern switching in real time just doesn't seem like it's quite right. But what I really do like is when we're creating patterns, all the access to the probability, the ratchets, and those sort of longer cyclical things are really quite intuitive and very powerful. So you can create like a 16 beat pattern and have loads of variation that would make that last for 4 bars. Or if you're doing longer, then you get even more variance. The Korg SQ64 is a nice little unit. It is a little bit more expensive than the original BeatStep Pro and not as expensive as the KeyStep Pro, but it has similar functions in the terms of number of track count and the drum triggers, etc. But what it does do is give you just an alternative way of working to those devices. I really like the way that you can use this to program beats. Just adding the probability and the step divisions, the same works with melodic patterns, means that programming sort of constantly changing and shifting patterns is really easy, much easier than I found on other sequencers at this sort of price. Add to that, you got these fill and rotate kind of features, plus the additional looping stuff. Just creates quite a lot of unique and interesting ways to kind of modify your sequences. Add to the fact there that you can also record quite a lot of sort of off-grid, although by the same token, you can't then quantize it. If you want quantize, you kind of have to do it by adding those in step time, which I don't know, I'm not so into that, but it would be nice to see a quantize function. The price is around £260 UK pounds. Other countries will scroll below. And certainly if you're looking for something that just has a slightly different take on sequencing. Maybe you're new to hardware sequencing and you want to try something else, or maybe you don't get on with some of the other ways of doing it, then the SQ64 is definitely worth trying. It's nicely built, it's almost spot on, but there's a few little gotchas, but it may be that it just speaks to the way that you like to work. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.